Good morning. My name is Michal Frankel from the Czech Academy of Sciences. And it's a privilege for me to be here, although only virtually, and to start what is a special track in GI Forum focused on geomedia and remembrance, and that was organized together with the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure Project, in which I'm also involved. And in thinking about geomedia, remembrance, and Holocaust history, we could have hardly invited a better guest than Tim Cole. Tim is professor of history at the University of Bristol. He's the director of the Bristol Institute, which is focused on interdisciplinary cooperation. Tim has authored very important texts and several books, including the history of the Holocaust in Budapest, and his most recent book, The Holocaust Landscapes. And he's known to work in an interdisciplinary way in cooperation of historians and geographers and GI scientists, and he's been involved from the beginning in the work of the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative, a project, a group which had a very strong impact on Holocaust, or the field of Holocaust history. Before Tim starts, Tim will talk for about 20-25 minutes, and we'll have space for discussion. And I assume that everyone will just place the questions and comments into the chat box, perhaps even before Tim finishes, so that I can prepare the questions and perhaps sort them if there's need for that. Tim, again, thanks for joining us. It's 1 hour earlier in the UK, so you're very brave. And with that, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Michal, and welcome everyone. Sorry that we meet in a virtual way rather than in a physical way. What I wanted to do was to offer some reflections on what has been now a decade-long project. And as with any of these large interdisciplinary digital humanities projects, it's one that has a very big team. As Michal said, it's an interdisciplinary team that ranges from GI scientists through historical geographers, cartographers, architectural historians, social historians. And more recently, we've also brought in colleagues who work on corpus linguistics, and a range of other data mining methods. We started about 10 years ago working together, and what I wanted to do was offer some reflections really on that process, about the application of GI science to think about the Holocaust both as a research topic as well as a teaching topic, and also as a memory project. So to try and think a little bit about some of the opportunities and I guess some of the challenges that we've faced in trying to work in a digital space to better understand the Holocaust. One of the things that we did when we first met was to try and think about testing a whole set of different GI science methods by taking the Holocaust and thinking about it as an event that happens at multiple scales. And I think that very much reflects the way that we approach this event as geographers, that we are interested as much in space and place, the where of the Holocaust happening, as we are in time and the when of happening. And I guess in the broader literature, I think in many ways Holocaust studies has been dominated by the approach of historians, and questions of time have been at the forefront of, in particular, debates around causation and when the Holocaust was ordered. But we were interested in trying to break the Holocaust down into a number of different scales that ranged from the continental scale. At one level, the Holocaust was an event that took place across the entire European continent, but it was also an event that took place around on a particular gendered human body. And so in a sense, we were interested in thinking about how far can GI science and GI science methods explore the spatiality of an event that ranges from the continental through to the body. And as I'll say a little bit more, I think in some ways I feel like GI science helped us at the scale of the continent to better understand the event, but I think it let us down when it came down much more towards individual bodies, and I'll say a bit more about that at the end. So one of the things that we were interested in doing was really thinking about how mapping would enable us to identify spatial patterns that remained invisible until we began to place them on a map. In particular, we were interested in the intersections of time and space. And so a lot of the mapping that we did was a series of, if you like, almost time-stamped maps, which would literally place events in time and space within the context of Europe. These are just a series of maps. I apologize for their tiny size, which show the evolution of the camp system. So we literally mapped out the opening and closing of all of the SS camps across Europe. And what you see is this mass proliferation of camps in 1944 with a kind of switch to labor. And suddenly the growth of a massive number of slave labor camps. So at the level of the European continent, I think what we found was that GIS science was a useful way to try and think about the Holocaust as a systemic event. So to map out those kinds of massive systems like the camp system. And one of the things that the project team is now doing is working with ghettos to do the very same thing for ghettos. So to map out the opening and closing of the ghettos across Europe, to start to see at a continental scale the kinds of spatial patterns of Nazi action. One of the other things we did was to work at a national scale and to map out, in this case, it was the arrests and deportations of Italian Jews. And to break that down, in a sense, to ask a set of analytical questions. I think the most interesting one is right at the center of this map. What it shows on the left is the spatial pattern of arrests by Germans of Jews. And what you see is some very large clusters that the pattern of arrests by Germans tended to be a relatively small number of arrest events, but very large numbers of Jews arrested in all of those events. And then on the right, you've got the pattern of arrests by Italians, by the Italian authorities. And it's a very different spatial pattern, that it's massive numbers of arrests, a large number of arrest events, but with relatively small numbers of Jews. And what I think was interesting about doing this is that it suddenly enabled us, this is a team led by Alberto Giordano, to visualize the way in which the Italian authorities were crucial in almost, if you like, a kind of mop-up action at the end, in the later stages of the war, after the initial kind of wave of arrests by German forces. And it pointed to the way in which there was a kind of collaboration taking place in the arrest and deportation of Jews. One thing that I think we felt GI science was particularly valuable in doing was enabling us to visualize the perpetrator archive. I guess in Holocaust studies, a large part of the early work that was done within the fields very much looked at the paperwork of the Nazis and worked with that to try and understand, in Hilberg's work, the how of the event, and then in later work, really the why of the event. And one thing that a team led by Paul Jascott did was to visualize the architectural drawings that survived from Auschwitz, the architectural office there. The entire architectural archive, more or less, survives extant. And so it was possible to start mapping out the archive. But this was not, in a sense, a kind of replication of the perpetrator's vision of a camp like Auschwitz. It was a much more critical interrogation of that. And I think that's one thing that's important. I guess there's a critical work and a very important critical literature on GI science that points to the way that GI science emerges within the industrial military complex and within a particular set of power relationships in late capitalism. And we were interested in bringing that kind of critique into our own analysis. So rather than, if you like, GI science being a way in which we take a perpetrator archive and just kind of visualize or showcase it in an uncritical and an unthinking way, that actually instead we interrogate that archive and we subject it to a more critical analysis. And what this map shows, this plan shows, is it shows in a sense in orange that you have at the top and at the bottom. It shows the parts of Auschwitz that the Nazis planned but never built. It shows in green the bits that they did build. It shows the unplanned. It shows in purple the bits that they never planned but did build. And so in some ways we could start to use GIS in a sense almost against the grain, in a more kind of critical way of subjecting the Nazi archive to that kind of critical forensic lens. Within the context of Auschwitz, I think one thing that visualizing the archive allowed was it allowed Auschwitz to be reimagined and thought of. This is Auschwitz Birkenau. The places that are in red are the barracks and the buildings that are under construction. This is through 1943 and then into 1944. And what this did, I think, was it really pointed to the fact that we need to reimagine Auschwitz as always a building site. As a constant construction site, that this was a place that was always being built. And that's really important in terms of understanding victim experiences in Auschwitz. The victims were living, those prisoners that were housed there, in a construction site, with all of the challenges that came with that, in particular the mud within this marshy field in occupied Poland, but also with the opportunities. And what's striking, I think, is that the greatest number of escapes from Auschwitz took place precisely at those moments of highest point of construction. This is just a viewshed analysis, kind of moving away from GIS to think about what Birkenau looks like if you imagine it as a construction site, that the majority of the site is being built. This is at a moment in 1944, just before the arrival of the Hungarian deportations to Birkenau. That idea of visualizing the archive was one that was central to the work that Alberto and I did in Budapest. Budapest has this very unusual ghetto in 1944 that's highly dispersed. It's spread in over 2,000 apartment buildings across the city. And one of the things that we were able to do with the GIS was to just literally start to map that out. So in a sense, a very similar project to either mapping out the entire camp system at a continental scale, or mapping out the barracks and construction within Auschwitz. It was relatively straightforward in some ways to also do that with the ghetto, to start to map out the ghetto and think a little bit about where the ghetto is in the city and how it changed. One thing that we were particularly interested in doing was bringing the perpetrator documents, in this case, lists of ghetto addresses, into conversation with other data that could help us to understand what was going on a little bit more. So in this case, what I show you is just a detail where we brought the census data and brought it into conversation so that we could start to weight density within the mapping, so that we made recognition of the fact that the large buildings in the center of the city were multi-occupancy apartment blocks, compared to the smaller family dwellings on the outskirts of the city. So to start to think a little bit about where Jews were living within this city, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. One thing that I think was really useful about this project, and this was typical, I think, of a lot of the projects, was that as we started to visualize the archive, there was often a kind of moment where those of us who were the historians on the team would have almost like a light bulb moment where we would see something that we'd not seen previously, that there'd be a whole new way of seeing because of taking the entire archive and trying to map it out and to visualize it. This is a map that looks in many ways relatively uncreative or unproductive. It's mapping out a crucial moment when the ghetto shrinks in size in Budapest, and it's using mean center and standard distance and directional distribution. So a set of analytic methods that can be used within the GIS to interrogate the GIS to find out where the center of gravity of this ghetto was. And what was striking was that the center of gravity of the ghetto, in a sense, didn't move. Even though the ghetto shrunk in size, you can see from the two rings that from green in mid-June to purple in late June, the ghetto shrunk in size, but actually the center of gravity of the ghetto stayed more or less the same. Another way of thinking about that is here with kernel density analysis on the left, the early part of June, on the right, the late part of June, when there's this dramatic shift in the ghetto, actually, in many ways, looking at kernel density analysis as a method allowed us to see that, in many ways, the center of gravity of this ghetto didn't change at all. And that was important, I think, because it forced us to reframe a set of research questions. If you go into the archive and you see that the ghetto has shifted dramatically in size in June, then I think you start to ask questions about why this change, and you start to ask questions that are primarily framed about a story of change rather than continuity. I think using GIS and using the analytical method suddenly started us to reframe those questions. It forced us to ask questions much more about continuity. Why did the ghetto stay more or less focused on these districts? And that really helped us to think about the fact that these were the areas of traditional Jewish demography and housing in the city. And we started to think about the ghetto being primarily something that was brought to Jews rather than Jews being brought to the ghetto. And it took us down, if you like, a kind of new avenue of trying to understand what was happening within this city. The other thing that we did with GIS, and increasingly we started to do this with a lot of the different projects, was to bring other layers into the map. So, for example, in mapping out the SS camp system, it was possible to start to bring in layers around industries or around quarrying, to start to think about the location of camps with critical industries. In the case of Budapest, the street network became important for us because Jews were primarily walking around the city in the afternoon when there was a curfew period, when they could leave their homes to go and buy foodstuffs in the shops. And we could start to visualize using the census data the networks, the street networks where Jews were on the street and where there were opportunities for exchange. And this led us to start to think a bit about the idea that actually in this very dispersed ghetto, that Jews were closer or further away from critical resources in 1944. One of the things that was particularly critical in this period was the paperwork offered by the neutral legations, the neutral powers. I've just marked out here the Swedish legation buildings, just in a yellow-blue cross at the south of the city. And what you see is walking distances of 30 minutes and then 60 minutes. And beyond that, a series of little purple push pins, which represent houses beyond that. And one thing we started to get interested in was actually how was distance navigated within a city like Budapest. Here we were using the GIS as a way of kind of modeling and posing a new set of questions. And what I think was particularly important about this process was that mapping became a way of returning to the archive with new questions. As I just mentioned, one thing that I think we went into this project thinking was that the story in Budapest around the ghetto was one primarily of change. And we started through the GIS to start asking questions of continuity. One thing that we started to do with these maps was we started to ask questions of distance and proximity of the archive, and in a sense to revisit the archive and to ask a new set of questions. Here's an example of just one interview undertaken by a project in Sweden, where we returned to the archive and suddenly paid attention to the critical role played by non-Jewish neighbors in getting hold of Swedish paperwork within this city, where distance mattered. In 1944. Now, returning to the archive in this way, and I'll just finish here, is one way where I think we started to reach the kind of limits of the model and the limits of GIS. And I just want to finish with one example where, in many ways, as we started to move through the scales and came to the scale of the human bodies, we started to think about individuals and particular individual experiences, that we started to get to the point where there was a kind of dissatisfaction in many ways with GIS. And one of the things I think we found was that GIS served us well when it was mapping out the entities or events that had the kind of certainty that a system like GIS needs. And often that was the data that we derived from the perpetrator archive. The way that we started to think about it was that GIS was a useful tool for mapping what we termed Nazi space. So it was a useful tool for visualizing the camp system or the ghetto system. It was a useful tool for taking the perpetrator archive and visualizing and interrogating it. So I think there was a critical dimension in all of our work, that it wasn't just replicating the archive, but it was much more a careful interrogation of the archive. But that when we started to turn to oral testimony, when we started to turn to interviews with survivors, this is a moment where GIS, in a sense, becomes less useful. A word like my building, a phrase like my building that we have here, is very hard to map with any certainty on a GIS because we don't know which building that is. But obviously, there's other ways of visualizing spatial data that move beyond GIS. And maybe I can just illustrate that finally by giving you one of the examples that really kind of pushed us in a new direction, I think, in our work. It was undertaken by Simone Gigliotti and Eric Steiner, primarily in the team. And what they wanted to do was map the so-called death marches, the evacuations out of Auschwitz in January 1945. And so what they were able to do was to use GIS to visualize the routes out of the camp in this period. But this only got so far. They could start to add topography to this map, and they could start to think a little bit about what the nature of evacuation was in terms of just the movement of Jews from Auschwitz to these entrainment points where they were then taken further west into the extant camp system. But it didn't really get at the heart of this kind of embodied experience, which was this scale that we really wanted to get to. So we didn't want to just map out at a continental scale or even a regional scale the nature of the Holocaust, but we wanted to try and interrogate in some ways and ask questions about what the experience of victims was. And it's there that we turned to victim testimony, to oral history, and thought about different ways of examining this. What the team did was they took a series of post-war, immediate post-war testimony, in this case by Polish political prisoners, and they started to map it out physically onto the route of the march. So at the top you can see the place where the camp at Reichkov, where these Polish prisoners were, and at the bottom you see the end of the march. And they could then start to do that across a whole series of prisoners and aggregate that. And what you find here is you find, in a sense, the individual letters and words of the testimony mapped out across what was a 60-kilometer march, with moments where there's a lot of talk at the beginning, at the top, and then at a particular moment where there's a murder that takes place around 50 kilometers. But there's also these moments of silence, these periods between 30 and 40 kilometers along the march, where there's nothing. There's a kind of blank space, and maybe those blank spaces are some of the most important spaces to understand experience. Another way that it was possible to do this was to think about the references to either a cluster of particular individuals, just on the third column down in a kind of blue-purple, who were killed by the SS officers just above them in red, or the camp capos, or the group of individuals. And this is really where we've moved, I think, from thinking primarily about using GIS as a way of visualizing the perpetrator archive and Nazi space, to now also trying to incorporate much more victim place, and to think about how we also bring testimony into the map. And that's very much the thing that we're working on at the moment. It's what we've been starting to write on in a more kind of conceptual and theoretical way. And it's what we're also starting to try and work on in a much more pragmatic and practical way as well, to think about what a GIS of place would look like, and not just a GIS of space when it comes to the Holocaust. But I'll leave it there because there hopefully will be some questions that have come in.
Okay. Thank you, Tim, for the wonderful presentation and for leading us through what has been a process spanning over, 15 years or so,
Yeah, right.
of thinking, and especially what I'd like to highlight, experimenting with thinking about place and space in Holocaust studies. And I can already see 2 questions. The first one is from Francis Harvey. Perhaps I read it. How do you go about verifying model results with the hermeneutic insights from other sources?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a particularly important question for the project, where a lot of the work that we have been doing is around not visualizing reality, but the visualizations have been a model of reality, that we're very conscious that they've been a model of reality. So if you take, for example, the routes that Jews in Budapest are taking to the marketplaces, what we are doing there is we're working with a set of assumptions that Jews would want to get to the marketplace quickly, because we know lines build up from other sources. So in a sense, the other sources frame the assumptions that the model is built on, or that they would take the main streets. Because of that, to get there most quickly, they take the least cost route. So we use the sources to frame the assumptions. But then what we're very conscious of is the fact that the model is not the reality. And in a sense, that's where I think the model has been particularly useful to then interrogate the sources. And so, if you like, rather than thinking about the sources just creating the model, and as I've suggested, they do, for example. So, for example, what we know about shopping habits at that time are very important in shaping a model. But actually, what I think is been particularly important for us is then that the model forces us to go back to the archive to look with a new lens, so to pay attention to things that we didn't see before. And that I think, Mikhail, like you mentioned, I think has been important in our work, is that rather than seeing GIS maps as a kind of final product, that they've been much more a part of a research process as we've tried to understand and interrogate the Holocaust.
Okay, then we have a second question about German institutions. Has this already been discussed with any German research institutions? I guess so.
Not a little bit, but in the main, a lot of the discussion that we've had has been, in particular, with American research institutions, and then through ARI, through research infrastructure, with a kind of broader range of research institutions within Europe, and then also through that a little bit with Yad Vashem. But I think I think there's a certain conservatism within Holocaust studies that I think Holocaust studies well, Michal, as a field. That my sense is that Holocaust studies rarely leads on methodological innovation, and normally follows some way behind. That it's a discipline that I think still remains dominated by historians, and that a lot of the kind of shifts towards more interdisciplinary ways of working that you find within a whole range of contexts, I think are still relatively new within the Holocaust. I think so. There's I think a certain kind of conservatism that I think is slowly changing, but I think will still take more time to shift.
My sense is that there are some real shifts in the Holocaust studies lately. And perhaps in relationship to the question, I should also say that the Holocaust geographies and Tim were quite important and prominent in the last Lessons and Legacies that took place in Munich, which I think relates it very strongly to German, not only to international, but German academia as well. And I wonder, Tim, if you can see the third question that we have from Igor Doroshenko. Is it possible to perform viewshed analysis to say what people could see and what not? For example, about Budapest Ghetto. How accurate could it be? Should it be always 3D? It could be very useful for mass killing sites, for example, in Eastern Europe, where one does not know where local residents could see something or not.
Yeah, it's a great question, which is something that the team in Auschwitz, the team that was working in Auschwitz, were really interested in doing. Because I think it is possible to viewshed analysis if you know the heights of the building. In the case of the Auschwitz archive, partly some of those buildings were extant, but also the building records, the architectural records were such that you could recreate building heights I think a lot depends on whether 1940s buildings are still extant and whether you can do that within urban contexts or say within Eastern Europe in villages, within rural contexts. But it does then become possible to interrogate what people could see, which I think is particularly useful when you think about both the kind of experience within the camp. So within Auschwitz, it was possible to start to imagine what either prisoners could see or what guards could see from different points in the camp, but also then to interrogate witness testimony. So for example, within the Auschwitz trial, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial in the 1960s, what people could see from where was a particularly important point within that trial, within the judicial context. And it was possible to start interrogating that by using viewshed analysis. So I think there's a lot of possibility and potential for viewshed analysis. I think, as you suggest, it really does get at that key question about, say, neighbors within the Eastern European context, about what neighbors could see, as well as I think also what neighbors could hear. There's some really interesting work that Christian Gerlach and his group are doing at the moment around sound from their team in Bern. And I think, again, that this is part of this, maybe this shift to paying more attention to broadly spatial ideas within Holocaust studies.
We have a question from Wolfgang Schonbacher. Whether you have also experimented with mapping the routes of deportation and further imprisonment of individuals from certain cities?
Yeah, we have done a little bit of that. What we've done is done that with individuals. To take testimony and to map individuals, and then to map family groups, and in particular to see the points where family groups are separated within the camp system. I think the data is the challenge there, Wolfgang, that in some ways there's often there's more certain data about fixed points like the camp system or the ghettos than there is about movement between. What's easier to do, for example, with GIS is for example, one of the groups has done some work on the transports from France, that it's relatively easy because of the paperwork there to map and visualize the transports of Jews from France to Auschwitz. What becomes harder then is to map the follow-on transports. There's sometimes ITS data that allows you to see Jews coming and going within the camp system, but that's patchy, it depends on survival. And the testimonies, there's these kind of blank spots within the testimonies, which we saw in that evacuations data. And so this is one of the things that we're starting to do more work on, is to think about how we can start to map out the Holocaust as an event of dislocation. So less placed entirely on fixed sites, but much more about movement through a whole series of sites. And these are movements away from home. And at the moment, it's easier to do that with an individual than it is to start scaling that up to do hundreds of individuals or thousands of individuals. That's the thing that we'd be very interested in doing, because I think it would then allow us to start thinking about bigger spatial patterns, across the event as a whole. One of the things that we're really interested in trying to do when we try and marry space and place together, Nazi space, victim place together, we're really interested in the idea that Scholl Friedlander talked about of integrated histories, where you get, in a sense, the individual and the systemic coming together, because I think genocide is about an event that's both systemic and also individual. And it's the kind of meeting point of that we're interested in developing techniques to do.
Yeah, and it looks like we have a number of questions coming in. One is about the reaction from Robert Carras, about the reactions of people who were indirectly or directly involved, reactions to the results.
It's a really perceptive question, Robert. We have found varied reactions from individuals. I think one of the things that any digital humanities project on the Holocaust faces is a criticism that it reduces individual suffering to dots on a map. Or to pixels, and so we've certainly faced that challenge. And it's one thing we've been very concerned about in our own work, that we recognise the ethical challenges of rendering, say, a 3D viewshed analysis of Auschwitz. That presents a whole series of ethical challenges. But I think we found that, as well as criticism from survivors, there's also been a sense from other survivors of seeing this as really important work to, in a sense, be a part of, I think in particular within a pedagogical and memorial context, a way in which the story of the Holocaust enters into the digital age in kind of responsible ways. And I think that's the thing that I think has been really striking is a desire, I think, for not just a rejection of the digital as somehow inappropriate, but a sense of thinking about, well, how can we do the digital in ethical and appropriate kinds of ways? And I think that's a much bigger debate that's taking place in very interesting ways around, say, the use of VR within Holocaust memory and education and research, or GI science, or any host of digital methodologies.
And I think the next two questions actually connect to this one. The one by, so we could take them together. The one by Gerhard is about whether the readers would need access to the interactive functionality of the GIS. And then there's Christine's question, pleading more or less for a public database and a public access to this data.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think those are really important points. One of the things we did with the Budapest project was we did create an interactive map that's available through Stanford Spatial History Lab. And that would allow people, in a sense, to interrogate the model themselves. And so to think about what kind of assumptions they'd place on the model so that they can create the map. And I think that sort of dynamic engagement is very important. I think in our project initially, one of the things that we did was that for us, the multiple maps were very much about our research process. So it was a way of interrogating the data and asking research questions. And in a sense, I think we'd want to encourage people into that process as well. So rather than saying, you know, here's a beautiful map we've made, you have it. It's actually, here's the tools to enable you to do your own mapping and your own visualization, so you can ask spatial questions. And I think, Christine, you're absolutely right that I think what we need is some kind of structure, which means that all of these maps can talk together and slot together. Because I think the danger is that all of us engage in these individual mapping projects, and yet we don't have a common framework, which means that those mapping projects don't connect. And I think in some ways, the ideal vision would be that we'd have a kind of common framework, maybe through something like EHRI, that would enable us all to feed in and slot in, so that our Budapest map could become part of a bigger map, so that you could kind of zoom in from the continent and you could look at an individual ghetto, but you could also then see about the development, say, of the ghetto system across Hungary as a whole or across Europe as a whole. And so that kind of shift, I think, towards a much more publicly and research available cartography, I think is where we need to move, because I think there's a value for this within research, but I think there's also a value for this within education or memory. So, for example, I know talking to, I've had conversations with some of the German memory sites, and one thing I think they'd be interested in is that a visitor to a site could then see the systemic sense of the camp system. So I might be at this particular site, say Bergen-Belsen, but actually what I see is how Bergen-Belsen fits into a bigger pattern that's unfolding across Europe. So that sense of zooming in and out of the map, which I think the question about interactive explores, I think that's very, very much what we'd want to do.
And historians very often are not used to share their research data. And perhaps this would be also something for ERI, the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, to take up. The next question is about historical maps from perpetrators and victims.
Yeah, there's plenty of maps, especially from the perpetrator side, but you also get sketches from victims, and then you also get maps in the immediate post-war periods from, say, in the ITS archive. There's a lot of mapping done by the French authorities of death march routes, and so we looked at a lot of those. And so I think those maps are incredibly important to draw upon within the GIS. And also to draw upon, because I think those maps are useful in thinking about how people conceptualized or imagine the world. So they give us an insight into the kind of mental geographies of individuals. One of the things I was interested in Holocaust Landscapes book was I was particularly interested in a Jewish guy in the ghetto who has he draws a map in his head for his sons of where safety lies. And so the prime map that he's doing is where is a safe place and where's a dangerous place, because he wants to make sure that his family gets to a safe place. And that kind of mapping of concepts like safety and danger and how those shift, are the things that I think some of those maps give you access to, in particular victim maps. And again, I think those are the kinds of ways in which we'd want this mapping project to shift away from just Nazi space, not just the infrastructure, say, of camps and of rail lines and road networks and ghettos, but also of those kinds of concepts. Like any particular moment in time, where did Jews imagine safety to lie? It is, to me, I think, a very important spatial question.
Next question from Hannah about Jewish places and spaces before the Holocaust and the question of longer term impact. Mm-hmm. And where giving testimony how it is located.
Yeah, which I think is a great question. One of the dangers, I guess, and you know this, Michal, as well, in Holocaust studies, is that Holocaust studies can take a kind of snapshot, which is it looks at, we're only interested in the events of maybe just immediately pre-Second World War, Second World War, and immediately post-Second World War. So a very narrow chronology and geography, which has occupied Europe during this period. And as you suggest, Hannah, I think there's a real value to broadening that chronology and geography to think about the 20th and the 21st century. And I think in particular, that's very important when you think about testimony. There's some great work done by Hannah Polingale. And what Hannah did was she looked at testimony given by Lithuanian survivors after the war in Lithuania, in America, and in Israel. And what she suggests is that actually they tell very different stories for very different purposes. That in Lithuania, they tell a much more forensic story, almost around judicial questions of what happened, where, when. In America, it's a much more celebratory story about learning from the Holocaust and about the kind of almost moral imperative of survivors. And within Israel, it's a story that's much more framed by Zionist narratives and the kinds of narratives that emerge within Israel. And so I think this sense of geography is critical in understanding the testimony that individuals give. So there's a kind of, if you like, a sort of second level of a geography to testimony that's critical to think about.
I think interestingly in our context, Hannah Polingale also has a section on analysis of non-places in which survivors cannot simply give it a name to the place. And how can you actually express this on a map? Would be a big challenge. I think we're already at the end of our time slot. We have one more comment from Christine about how you can integrate local data, mm-hmm. which I think is something for us to think as we go ahead. Right?
Yeah, and I think Christine mentions the Stolpersteine, the Stepping Stones project, and I think Stumbling Stones, and I think there is a sense there where what's interesting, I think, Christine, about that is the way that research and teaching and memory come together within these kinds of mapping methods. The thing about the Stumbling Stones is they provide this kind of material kind of routing to a place. And there's potential, I think, to connect that kind of material routing to a digital interface along the kind of ways that we've discussed and thought about, that connects the places within Europe, within this event that does take place at everything, as I've suggested, from the continental scale down to individual gendered bodies.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone, for participation in which I think was a great session. Unfortunately, only virtually, and I think we'll be really looking forward for your next steps and the progress with the GIS of place.
Yeah, which is the hard bit, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now we try the hard
bit. But I'm an optimist, so we're really looking forward to this. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone.